Welcome to Dr. Creepin's Dungeon. Small changes to our everyday lives can be surprisingly unsettling because we rely on familiar routines to give a sense of safety and control. And something ordinary is suddenly different. A familiar street looks slightly altered, an object is out of place, or someone behaved in a way they normally wouldn't. It can create a nagging feeling that something is wrong. The change itself may be harmless, but our minds instinctively search for an explanation. When we can't find one, uncertainty takes over. In horror, this is especially powerful because it transforms the familiar into something subtly, almost imperceptibly strange, as we shall see in tonight's 3 stories. Now, as ever before we begin, a word of caution. Tonight's tales may contain strong language as well as descriptions of violence and horrific imagery. That sounds like your kind of thing. Then let's begin. Harvest Hill by Darius McCorkindale. I've lived my whole life in the small, idyllic farming town of Harvest Hill, where the annual pumpkin festival is more than just an event. It's a cherished tradition that brings the entire community together. Every fall, the townsfolk gather in the town square, surrounded by the glowing red and yellow of autumn leaves, to celebrate the season's bounty and compete for the coveted title of the largest pumpkin. For years I'd dreamed of winning that prize, but this year my hopes were higher than ever. Nestled at the edge of town, my modest farmhouse is surrounded by meticulously tended gardens. Each morning I wake at dawn, don my gardening gloves, and tend to my plants with the care and precision of a master craftsman. This year my pride and joy was a massive pumpkin that I'd nurtured from a tiny seedling into a colossal gourd. Sat in the center of my garden, its vibrant orange skin gleaming in the sunlight. I couldn't help but feel a surge of pride every time I looked at it. However, there was one garden in Harvest Hill that always caught my eye with a mix of curiosity and unease. Old Farmer Joe's. His property, just next door to mine, was shrouded in mystery. The garden was overgrown and wild, and yet his pumpkins always seemed to grow bigger and healthier than anyone else's. Joe was a reclusive, eccentric man who rarely spoke to anyone, and when he did, his words were often cryptic and unsettling. The townspeople often gossiped that he held secrets, old and dark, but of course this was all wild speculation, and no one knew anything for sure. As the days grew shorter and the festival drew near, I found myself working tirelessly in my garden, determined to finally outdo Joe and claim the grand prize. Well, the townsfolk noticed my dedication and would often stop by to admire my giant pumpkin, offering words of encouragement and praise. The excitement was tangible, and for the first time I felt that victory was within my grasp. The day of the festival arrived with a crisp chill in the air. We were in the midst of autumn, and the town square was alive with activity, filled with stalls selling homemade pies, caramel apples, and other seasonal treats. Children ran around in costumes, laughing and playing, while adults admired the various pumpkins on display. My pumpkin, transported with great care, sat proudly among the contenders, drawing gasps of admiration from the crowd. As the judges made their rounds, carefully inspecting each entry, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. When they finally approached my pumpkin, their eyes widened in surprise, and I saw them exchange impressed glances. After what felt like an eternity, they announced the winner. My pumpkin claimed top prize. The crowd erupted in applause as I stepped forward to accept the trophy. My fellow townsfolk clapped me on the back and congratulated me, their faces beaming with genuine happiness. Now, amid the celebration, old Farmer Joe approached me. His weathered face broke into a rare smile as he shook my hand, his grip firm and uncomfortably tight. "Congratulations," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "You've done well this year. But remember, there's always a secret to true growth." His strange words lingered in my mind long after the festivities had ended, and and the crowd had dispersed. As I stood alone in my garden that evening, gazing at the enormous pumpkin that had brought me such joy, a strange sense of unease began to creep in. What did Joe mean by a secret to true growth? And why did his smile seem more like a warning than a congratulation? Well, little did I know, the answer to those questions would soon turn the essence of my existence upside down, revealing a dark secret that lay hidden beneath the fertile soil of Harvest Hill. My first night after the festival, I experienced fitful sleep and unsettling dreams. I kept waking up to the image of old Farmer Joe's cryptic smile and the ominous tone in his voice. By the first light of morning, all the elation I'd felt in victory had faded, replaced by a gnawing curiosity about old Joe's parting words. Well, I was determined to get to the bottom of it, so I decided to pay Joe a visit. Under the guise of thanking him for his congratulations, I approached his property, feeling apprehensive and yet determined to find out what he meant. His garden, as always, was an overgrown mess of vines and leaves, with enormous pumpkins peeking out from the undergrowth. The sheer size of his produce, even larger than mine, seemed, well, almost unnatural. I found Joe in the back, hunched over a patch of particularly large pumpkins. He straightened up as I approached, wiping his hands on his worn overalls. "Yeah, morning, Joe," I called out, trying my best to sound casual. "I just want to thank you for your kind words yesterday." Joe looked up, his eyes sharp and piercing despite his age. "Oh, you're welcome," he said slowly, as if measuring each word. "Your pumpkin was truly impressive. Here, what brings you here?" Taking a deep breath, I decided to broach the subject directly. "Well, I couldn't stop thinking about what you said, about the secret to true growth. What did you mean by that?" For a moment, Joe said nothing. Then he motioned for me to follow him. He walked through his garden, the dense foliage brushing against us, until we reached an old, decrepit shed. Joe pushed open the door, revealing a cluttered space filled with gardening tools, jars of strange substances, and dusty old books. "Well, curiosity can be a dangerous thing," he said, rummaging through a pile of papers. "But since you've come this far, you deserve to know." He handed me an ancient leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. "This," he said, "is a grimoire of sorts. Been passed down through my family for generations. It contains a knowledge that most would deem unnatural." I opened the book, my eyes scanning the strange symbols and diagrams that filled its pages. There were detailed instructions on rituals, strange ingredients, and dark incantations. Oh, my heart raced as I realized the implication of what I was seeing. Is this magic?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Joe nodded. "Not the kind of thing you'd read about in fairy tales, but something much older and darker. It's a form of alchemy, using the natural world to bend nature to your will. My pumpkins thrive because of these rituals, but, well, they come at a cost." "What cost?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. Joe's expression grew grave. "The soil here is enriched with more than just nutrients. It requires sacrifices. Animal blood, bones, and, well, sometimes other things. The magic demands a balance." I stared at him in disbelief, the weight of his words sinking in. "And my pumpkin, how did it grow so large?" Joe sighed. Saw your dedication and wanted to help. So I enhanced your soil when you weren't looking. I thought it was harmless. Way to give you a taste of success, but, well, I fear I may have set something in motion." My mind reeled with the implications. My prize-winning pumpkin, the source of my pride and joy, was the result of dark, unnatural forces. The sense of accomplishment I'd felt now seemed hollow and tainted. As I left Joe's garden, clutching the grimoire tightly, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd crossed a line. The vibrant orange of my pumpkin now seemed sinister, and the whispers of the town took on a more menacing tone. The once idyllic Harvest Hill was now shrouded in a shadow of ancient secrets and dark magic, and I was at the center of it all. The true horror of my situation was beginning to unfold, and I knew that uncovering the full extent of Joe's secrets would come at a price I might not be willing to pay. The days following old Farmer Joe's revelation were filled with dread but also undeniable fascination. I couldn't bring myself to destroy the grimoire he'd given me. No, instead I spent hours poring over its ancient pages, trying to understand the arcane rituals and the nature of the dark forces that were at work. The more I read, the more I realized how deep and dangerous this magic was. As I delved deeper into the grimoire, I noticed strange changes in my garden. Other plants began to grow at an alarming rate, their leaves larger and more vibrant than ever before. The soil, once rich and loamy, took on a darker hue and a peculiar smell. The once comforting sounds of nature were now accompanied by eerie whispers and rustling noises that seemed to emanate from the very ground. Despite my growing unease, I continued to seek Joe's guidance, hoping to find a way to undo what had been done. Our conversations grew increasingly bizarre, though. Joe spoke in riddles, his eyes often glazing over as if he were communicating with something unseen. He mentioned ancient spirits of the harvest, entities that demanded offerings in exchange for their gifts. "You've tapped into something old and powerful," Joe said one evening as we stood by the garden fence. "The spirits are pleased, but they're never satisfied for long. They will demand more." "What do you mean by more?" I asked, a sense of dread curling in my stomach. Joe's face darkened. "The rituals, they require balance. You must give back to the earth what you take. The larger the bounty, the greater the sacrifice." That night I awoke to strange noises outside my window. Peering into the darkness, I saw shadows moving in the garden, shifting and twisting in unnatural ways. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. I grabbed a flashlight and ventured outside, my heart pounding in my chest. As I approached the center of the garden, the light illuminated a horrifying sight. Small animals, rabbits, birds, even a stray cat, lying dead among the plants, their bodies seemingly drained of life. The vines of the giant pumpkin had grown thicker, their tendrils wrapping around the lifeless creatures as if drawing nourishment from them. The pumpkin, which I'd severed from its roots to take to the festival, was now reattached to the ground. Panic set in, and I realized that whatever magic had been used was spiraling out of control. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. Desperate for a solution, I visited the town library to research the history of Harvest Hill and its connection to old Farmer Joe's family. The librarian, an elderly woman with a wealth of knowledge about the town's past, led me to a dusty archive filled with old newspapers and records. As I sifted through the yellowed pages, I uncovered stories of mysterious disappearances and unexplained phenomena dating back generations. Each incident seemed to coincide with particularly bountiful harvests at Joe's property. One article detailed the sudden disappearance of a young girl during a pumpkin festival many years ago, hinting at foul play but never proving anything. The deeper I dug, the more I realized that Joe's family had been long rumored to practice dark rituals. The townsfolk, though wary, had always turned a blind eye due to the prosperity the harvests brought. Back at home, I began to experience vivid nightmares. I dreamt of being buried alive, of roots and vines slowly constricting around my body, pulling me deeper into the earth. Each morning I awoke drenched in sweat, the images lingering in my mind. Sarah, my wife, noticed the change in me. "You've been acting strange," she said one morning, her eyes filled with concern. "What's going on?" I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth, though. Not the full truth. "It's just stress from the festival," I lied, trying to sound convincing. "I'll be fine." But Sarah wasn't the only one who noticed. Neighbors began to comment on the unusual growth in my garden, their curiosity tinged with suspicion. I could see the unease in their eyes, the way they whispered when they thought I wasn't listening. Determined to find a way to reverse the dark magic, I began documenting everything. I took photos of the garden, recorded the strange noises, and even collected samples of the soil. My collection of evidence grew, but so did my paranoia. I felt like I was being watched, not just by Joe, but by something else, something ancient and malevolent. One night, while reviewing the footage from my garden camera, I saw a shadowy figure lurking near the pumpkin patch. It wasn't Joe. The figure was tall and lean, dressed in dark clothing, and moved with a stealthy purpose. My blood ran cold as I realized the figure was performing a ritual, chanting words I couldn't understand. The next morning, I found the pumpkin even larger, its vines more aggressive. In a moment of clarity, I confronted Joe one last time. "Look, I've seen the rituals. I know what you've done," I said, my voice trembling with fear and anger. "Tell me how to stop it." Joe sighed, his shoulders slumping as if carrying the weight of centuries. You can't stop it," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Spirits are already here. The only way to appease them is with a greater sacrifice." "What kind of sacrifice?" I demanded, my mind racing through the possibilities. Joe looked at me with a mix of pity and resignation. "You know what kind," he said. "Blood for growth. Life for life." As his words sank in, I realized the true horror of my situation. The price of my success was far greater than I could have ever imagined, and the darkness I'd unleashed was now beyond my control. Part 2. The situation reached a horrifying turning point on a cold, moonless night. The ghostly quiet of the garden was shattered by an unsettling noise, a low hum that seemed to resonate from the very earth itself. Unable to sleep, I decided to investigate, clutching the grimoire tightly and armed with a flashlight. As I stepped into the garden, the hum grew louder, vibrating through the ground and into my bones. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the twisted vines of my giant pumpkin, which now seemed almost sentient, writhing and pulsing as if alive. My heart pounded as I moved closer, the sense of impending doom thick in the air. Suddenly, I saw it. An area of disturbed soil near the pumpkin, freshly turned and dark with moisture. Kneeling down, I used my hands to brush away the loose dirt, uncovering something that made my blood run cold. Beneath the soil were the remains of small animals, their bodies contorted in unnatural ways. And among them, a human hand protruded, the flesh pale and lifeless. A wave of nausea swept over me as I realized the full extent of the horror. This was no longer just about a giant pumpkin or an eccentric neighbor. The garden had become a graveyard. The dark magic I'd unknowingly nurtured now demanded human lives as its true price. Desperate for answers, I turned to the grimoire, flipping through the pages with shaking hands. The ancient text described a ritual of appeasement, a way to communicate with the spirits of the forest. The instructions were clear but chilling. A sacrifice was needed to stop the dark forces, one that matched the scale of the magic used. Fueled by feelings of both fear and purpose, I stormed over to Joe's house, the grimoire clutched in my hand. He met me at the door, his expression one of grim understanding. "I found the bodies, Joe," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and horror. "How do I stop this?" Joe sighed, his face etched with lines of regret and sorrow. "I warned you about the cost," he said softly. "The spirits demand balance. The greater the gift, the greater the sacrifice." "Tell me how to end it," I demanded, desperation creeping into my voice. Joe led me to his cluttered shed once more. From a hidden compartment, he retrieved a small, intricately carved wooden box. Opening it, he revealed a ceremonial dagger and a piece of parchment covered in ancient runes. "This is the ritual of severance," he explained. "It's the only way to break the bond with the spirits. But it requires a life for a life." My heart sank as I realized the implications. The life of someone I loved would have to be sacrificed to undo the dark magic that had taken hold of my garden. The weight of this knowledge bore down on me like a crushing force. Returning home, I found Sarah waiting for me, her eyes filled with concern. "What's going on?" she asked. "You've been so distant, and the garden, it feels wrong." Torn between the need to protect her and the truth of what I'd discovered, I decided to tell her everything. As I recounted the dark history of old Farmer Joe's magic and the horrific revelation in the garden, Sarah's face paled. "We need to leave," she said urgently. "We can't stay here. It's too dangerous." But I knew running wouldn't solve the problem. The spirits were bound to the land, and they wouldn't let us escape so easily. The only way to free ourselves was to complete the ritual, but I couldn't bring myself to suggest the unthinkable. In the days that followed, the garden's transformation accelerated. The giant pumpkin grew even larger, its vines spreading like a cancer across the property, suffocating everything in their path. The eerie hum became a constant presence, a sinister reminder of the dark forces at play. As the situation grew more dire, I spent hours each day in the library seeking any alternative to the ritual of severance. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, casting long shadows across the town, I stumbled upon an old forgotten diary tucked away in the archives. The diary belonged to a woman named Margaret, who had lived in Harvest Hill over a century ago. Her entries detailed her own encounters with the dark magic and the spirits of the harvest. In her final entry, she wrote of a similar situation, describing the unbearable choice she had to make to protect her family. "My husband's life was the price I paid," Margaret wrote, "but the spirits are never truly satisfied. They always return, hungry for more. The cycle must be broken or it will continue forever." With a sinking heart, I realized the full horror of what Joe had been trying to tell me. The ritual of severance might only be a temporary solution. The spirit's hunger could not be sated for long, and the dark magic would eventually return, demanding new sacrifices. Standing in my garden that night, surrounded by the monstrous vines and the eerie hum, I felt the weight of an impossible decision. The midpoint of my journey had revealed the true nature of the darkness I faced, and the path ahead was fraught with danger and sacrifice. In the distance, old Farmer Joe's house stood in shadow, a silent witness to the legacy of the dark magic. As I stared at the giant pumpkin, its surface pulsating with a malevolent life, I knew that the hardest part of my ordeal was yet to come. The night of the final confrontation arrived, shrouded in an unnatural darkness that seemed to swallow all light. The air was heavy with the scent of decaying leaves and the pervasive hum of the restless spirits. The giant pumpkin, now a monstrous, grotesque behemoth, dominated my garden, its vines twisting and writhing with a life of their own. Desperate to end the nightmare, I gathered the necessary items for the ritual of severance: the ceremonial dagger, the ancient parchment, and a vial of my own blood. Each item felt like a lead weight in my hands. the significance of what I was about to do pressing down on me. Sarah stood by my side, her face pale but resolute. She'd insisted on being there, despite my attempts to protect her from the full horror of the situation. And her presence gave me strength, but it also deepened my fear of what might come. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. The decision had been made, and there was no turning back. Together we walked to the heart of the garden, where the monstrous pumpkin loomed. I knelt before the pumpkin, spreading the parchment on the ground and placing the dagger and vial beside it. With a deep breath, I began to chant the incantation from the grimoire, my voice shaking but gaining strength as I went on. The words felt foreign and ancient, resonating with a power that made the air around us vibrate. The vines reacted almost immediately, writhing more violently, as if sensing the impending threat. The hum grew louder, filling my ears and making it difficult to concentrate. I took the vial of blood and poured it onto the parchment, watching as the dark liquid seeped into the ancient runes, making them glow with an eerie light. As I continued the chant, I felt a presence growing stronger, an unseen force that seemed to watch and judge my every move. The final part of the ritual required the sacrifice of a life, one that had been touched by the dark magic. I'd hoped that the animal sacrifices Joe had made would be enough, but deep down I knew it wasn't. Tears streamed down my face as I raised the ceremonial dagger. I turned to Sarah, her eyes wide with fear and understanding. "I'm so sorry," I whispered, my voice breaking. Before I could act, though, a powerful force knocked me to the ground, the dagger flying from my hand. The vines surged forward, wrapping around Sarah and lifting her into the air. She screamed, struggling against the crushing grip of the tendrils. "No!" I shouted, scrambling to my feet and grabbing the dagger. I slashed at the vines, but more took their place, pulling Sarah towards the monstrous pumpkin. Desperation fueled my actions as I hacked and cut, my hands slick with blood from the thorny tendrils. Suddenly, old Farmer Joe appeared, his face a mask of determination and sorrow. "This is my doing," he said, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. "I have to set it right." With a swift motion, he took the dagger from my hand and plunged it into his own chest. The vines recoiled, releasing Sarah and retracting towards the pumpkin. Joe fell to the ground, blood pooling around him as he chanted the final words of the ritual. The air crackled with energy as the ground trembled beneath our feet. The giant pumpkin began to wither, its vibrant orange fading to a sickly brown. The vine shriveled and turned to dust, releasing a cloud of dark, acrid smoke. The hum intensified, reaching a deafening crescendo before abruptly stopping. Joe's body lay still, his sacrifice complete. The garden fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting as the dark magic dissipated. The spirits, momentarily appeased by Joe's selfless act, retreated into the earth, their hunger sated for now. Sarah and I stood in stunned silence, the horror of what had just happened slowly sinking in. The garden, once a source of such pride and joy, was now a barren wasteland, the remnants of the dark magic leaving an indelible mark. We buried Joe next to his monstrous pumpkin, marking his grave with a simple stone. His sacrifice had saved us, but the cost had been immeasurable. As we left the garden, I couldn't shake the feeling that the spirits were still watching, waiting for their next opportunity. The climax of our ordeal had revealed the true price of tampering with forces beyond our understanding. The darkness that had taken root in Harvest Hill was not so easily vanquished, and the memory of that fateful night would haunt us forever. The ultimate confrontation had ended, but the scars it left behind would remain, a chilling reminder of the danger that lurked beneath the surface of our once idyllic town. Part 3. The days following the climactic confrontation were a blur of exhaustion and grief. The garden, once the pride of my efforts, was now a desolate patch of scorched earth and withered plants. The giant pumpkin had collapsed into a decaying heap, its vibrant orange hue now a sickly brown. The oppressive atmosphere that hung over our home seemed to dissipate, leaving a profound silence in its wake. Sarah and I struggled to come to terms with the events that had transpired. We moved through our daily routines in a daze, haunted by the memories of that fateful night. Old Farmer Joe's sacrifice had saved us, but the price had been high and the weight of guilt and sorrow was overwhelming. News of the bizarre occurrences spread quickly through Harvest Hill. The townspeople, initially skeptical, became increasingly curious and wary. They whispered about the giant pumpkin, the strange lights, and the eerie hum that had emanated from our property. Joe's sudden death added to the sense of mystery and fear that gripped the town. One afternoon, the town council paid us a visit. They stood in our barren garden, their faces a mixture of disbelief and concern. "What happened here?" asked Mayor Thompson, his voice filled with apprehension. I hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "There was, an incident," I said slowly. "Old Farmer Joe tried to help us, but things got out of control. He sacrificed himself to stop it." The council members exchanged uneasy glances. "We've heard rumors about Joe and his family," said Mrs. Henderson, the town librarian. "Dark rumors. Is there any truth to them?" I nodded reluctantly. "Joe had knowledge of ancient rituals, kind of dark magic. It's what caused the giant pumpkin to grow so large. But it came with a price." The council members fell silent, absorbing the gravity of my words. "We need to ensure this never happens again," said Mayor Thompson finally. "The town must be protected." Sarah and I knew we couldn't stay in Harvest Hill. The memories were too painful, and the whispers too loud. We decided to sell our property and move to a neighboring town, hoping to find a fresh start away from the darkness that had consumed our lives. As we packed our belongings, I couldn't help but feel a lingering unease. The grimoire, now hidden away in a locked chest, seemed to call to me, its pages filled with secrets I could never unlearn. I debated whether to destroy it, but something held me back, the fear that the knowledge within might be needed again. On our last day in Harvest Hill, Sarah and I visited Joe's grave. We placed a small bouquet of wildflowers on the simple stone marker, a silent thank you for his sacrifice. The air was still, the oppressive presence of the spirits gone, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't entirely vanquished. Harvey still took measures to prevent a recurrence of the dark magic. The town council declared Joe's property off limits, eventually bulldozing the decrepit shed and covering the garden with fresh soil. They held a town meeting to discuss the strange events, urging residents to remain vigilant and to report any unusual occurrences. The town slowly returned to normal, but the memory of the giant pumpkin and the dark rituals lingered. Stories and legends grew around the events, becoming a cautionary tale passed down through generations. Harvest Hill would never forget the price of tampering with forces beyond their understanding. In our new town, Sarah and I worked hard to rebuild our lives. The shadow of Harvest Hill loomed over us, but we found solace in each other's company and the fresh start that we created. We planted a small garden, careful to only use natural methods, and watched as it flourished without the taint of dark magic. But the past was never far behind. I kept the grimoire hidden, a reminder of the danger that knowledge could bring. Late at night, when the world was quiet, I would sometimes hear the faint hum of the spirits in my dreams, a chilling reminder of the darkness that still lurked beneath the surface. Our new life was a testament to resilience and the power of love. but it was also a constant struggle to keep the shadows at bay. The events in Harvest Hill had changed us forever, leaving scars that would never fully heal. In the end, we learned to live with the memory, finding strength in our shared experiences and the hope that we could prevent such horrors from ever happening again. This part of our story was a quiet one, marked by the slow but steady process of healing and the enduring reminder of the price we'd paid for our brush with darkness. Years passed, and Sarah and I slowly built a peaceful life in our new town. The horrors of Harvest Hill faded into distant memories, although the scars always remained. We had a child, a bright and curious boy named Tommy, who brought joy and light into our lives. Our small garden flourished naturally, free from any dark influences. One crisp autumn evening, as we were putting Tommy to bed, he handed me a small, carved wooden box he'd found while playing in the attic. My heart skipped a beat when I saw it. It was the same intricate design as the box Joe had used to store his ceremonial dagger. "Daddy, look what I found," Tommy said, his eyes wide with excitement. "It's full of old papers and stuff." With trembling hands, I opened the box. Inside were several yellowed pieces of parchment, covered in familiar runes, and a small vial of dark, dried liquid. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what it was. The remnants of the grimoire and the tools for dark rituals. Late that night, after Sarah and Tommy were asleep, I sat alone at the kitchen table, the contents of the box spread before me. My mind raced as I tried to understand how these items had followed us. Had the spirits somehow transferred their connection to our new home? Or had the dark magic never truly left me? As I studied the parchments, a familiar hum began to fill the air, soft at first, then growing louder. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized the horrifying truth. The spirits had found us, and they were growing restless once again. Suddenly a shadow flickered across the kitchen, and the air grew icy cold. I turned, expecting to see some ghastly apparition, but instead there was nothing. The hum, however, persisted, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked just out of sight. Unable to ignore the growing sense of dread, I knew I had to act quickly. I retrieved the hidden grimoire and compared it to the new parchments, hoping to find a way to protect my family. As I read, it became clear that the spirits were not simply satisfied with the occasional sacrifice. They sought to bind themselves permanently to a powerful source of life, such as a child. Panic surged through me as I realized their target was Tommy. Desperate to shield him from the impending danger, I decided to confront the spirits directly. I returned to the garden, now bathed in the eerie glow of the full moon, clutching the grimoire and the ceremonial items. Standing in the center of the garden, I began to chant the incantations from the grimoire, calling forth the spirits. The ground trembled beneath my feet, and the air grew thick with a palpable energy. The vines around the garden began to stir, twisting and curling as if awakened by my words. A shadowy figure emerged from the darkness, its form shifting and indistinct. It was the same figure I'd seen in the garden all those years ago, the entity that had fed on the sacrifices. It spoke in a voice that seemed to echo from the depths of the earth. "You have summoned us," it intoned, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. "What do you seek?" "Release my family," I demanded, my voice steady despite the fear consuming me. "You've taken enough. Let us live in peace." The figure laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "The bond is not so easily broken," it said. "A life for a life, remember. But there are other ways to appease us." Desperate, I offered myself in place of my son. "Just take me," I pleaded. "Just leave my family alone." The spirit considered my offer, his eyes narrowing. "A noble sacrifice," it mused. We require something more. Your life alone is not enough. You must bind your bloodline to us, ensuring that our connection endures. The full weight of the spirit's demand crashed down on me. Binding my bloodline meant condemning future generations to the same darkness I'd tried so hard to escape. But there was no other way to protect Tommy and ensure his immediate safety. With a heavy heart, I agreed. I will bind my bloodline to you, I said, my voice breaking. But spare my son and allow us to live in peace for as long as we can. The spirit's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. So be it said, extending a shadowy hand. Now seal the pact. With trembling hands, I used the ceremonial dagger to cut my palm, letting the blood drip onto the ancient parchment. The runes glowed bright red, and the hum intensified, resonating through the garden and into the night. As the ritual concluded, the shadowy figure dissipated, and the garden fell silent once more. The oppressive silence lifted, leaving me drained, but relieved. I returned to the house where Sarah and Tommy slept soundly, unaware of the pact that had been made. The next morning I buried the grimoire and the ceremonial items deep in the forest, far from our home. The garden slowly returned to its natural state, free from the monstrous growths and the eerie hum. Life continued, seemingly peaceful, but I could never forget the price we'd paid. Years later, as I watched Tommy grow into a bright and inquisitive young man, I couldn't help but feel a pang of dread. The spirit's hunger had been sated for now, but the pact I'd made would hang over our family like a dark cloud, a chilling reminder of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface. In the quiet moments, when the wind rustled through the trees or the moon cast long shadows across the yard, I could still hear the faint, sinister hum, a reminder that the spirits were always watching, waiting for the next chapter of our bloodline to unfold. I used a Ouija board and set a demon free. By Darius McCorkindale. Ouija boards are tricky contraptions. Even the most seasoned demonologist will tell you to treat them with extreme caution. As Karen walked through the antiquity shop, her eyes were drawn to an elaborate display in the far corner. The shelves were lined with ancient artifacts, each more mysterious and sinister than the last. But it was the Ouija board on the center shelf that captured her attention. Unlike any she'd seen before, this board was crafted from a pale, bone-like material. Intricate carvings of arcane symbols adorned its surface, and the planchette seemed to glint menacingly under the flickering light of an overhead chandelier. As Karen reached out to touch it, a chill ran down her spine. "Careful with that," came a voice from behind her. She turned to see the shop's salesman, a gaunt man with sharp features and piercing eyes, watching her intently. "That's not a toy." "I'm not afraid," Karen replied, her curiosity nonetheless piqued. "What's so special about this one?" The salesman stepped closer, his expression serious. "That board is made from human bones," he said, his voice low and grave. "It was crafted by an ancient cult, using the remains of a powerful sorcerer executed for necromancy. They believed the sorcerer's spirit could be bound within the board, granting it immense power." Well, Karen felt a thrill of both excitement and apprehension. Why would someone make such a thing? Well, to harness the sorcerer's power, or to control his spirit, the salesman explained. But it's dangerous. The spirit within is malevolent, and those who use the board risk unleashing his wrath. Despite the ominous warning, Karen couldn't resist the allure of the board. She'd always been fascinated by the occult, and this seemed like the ultimate find. She picked it up, feeling the cold, smooth surface under her fingers. "I'll take it," she said, ignoring the nagging doubt in the back of her mind. The salesman sighed, a mixture of resignation and concern in his eyes. Right, be careful. Follow the instructions precisely and never, ever use it alone. Karen nodded, though her thoughts were already racing ahead to the possibilities. As she paid for the board and left the shop, the salesman's final words echoed in her ears. Some things are better left undisturbed. That night, as she set the Ouija board on her dining table, all she could think about was why someone would bother to create one using human bones. She would later regret not learning why. The evening air was thick with anticipation as Karen and her best friend Lily settled into the cozy confines of Karen's living room. The lights were dimmed, casting long shadows across the room, and a circle of candles flickered softly, adding to the eerie ambience. The Ouija board lay in the center of the coffee table, its bone-white surface gleaming in the candlelight. "I can't believe you've actually bought that thing," Lily said, eyeing the board warily. "You know these things are just for fun, right? They don't actually work." Karen smirked, a mix of excitement and defiance in her eyes. "Well, we'll see about that. Besides, it's not just any Ouija board. Yeah, the guy at the shop said it was made from human bones and has some powerful spirit trapped inside." Lily rolled her eyes, but couldn't hide her curiosity. "All right, let's get this over with. What do we do?" Karen consulted the old, yellow instruction booklet that came with the board. "First, we place our fingers lightly on the planchette. Then we ask a question and let the spirit guide our hands." They positioned themselves around the table, each placing 2 fingers on the planchette. The atmosphere grew tense as Karen took a deep breath. "Is there a spirit here who wishes to communicate with us?" For a few moments, nothing happened. The planchette remained still, and the only sound was the crackling of the candles. Then, slowly, the planchette began to move. Karen and Lily exchanged wide-eyed glances as it glided across the board, spelling out a chilling response. Y-E-S. "Did you move that?" Lily whispered, her voice trembling. "No, I swear," Karen replied, her heart pounding in her chest. "Let's ask another question." "What is your name?" Karen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The planchette began to move again, faster this time, as if eager to communicate. It spelled out M-A-L-A-C-H-I. "Malachi," Karen repeated, the name sending a shiver down her spine. What do you want?" The planchette zipped across the board, spelling out a single word. F-R-E-E. Suddenly the room grew colder, and the candles flickered violently. A gust of icy wind swept through the room, extinguishing the flames and plunging them into darkness. Karen and Lily gasped, their fingers still on the planchette, which now felt ice cold. "This isn't funny, Karen," Lily said, her voice shaking. "I think we should stop." But Karen was transfixed, feelings of fear and fascination holding her in place. "We need to know more. Malachi, how can we free you?" The planchette moved with a speed and force that made their fingers ache. It spelled out B-L-O-O-D. A sudden loud crash echoed from the kitchen, making them both jump. Karen's cat, Midnight, hissed and darted out of the room. The candles flared back to life on their own, casting an ominous glow over the room. Karen and Lily stared at each other, realizing they'd unleashed something far more sinister than they'd anticipated. "We need to end this," Lily said urgently, pulling her hands away from the planchette. Karen hesitated, but eventually nodded, removing her fingers as well. "Goodbye, Malachi," she said, hoping to close the session properly. But the planchette moved on its own, spelling out a final, chilling message. TOOLATE. The candles went out again, leaving them in pitch darkness. The temperature in the room plummeted, and they could hear faint, sinister whispers surrounding them. Karen fumbled for her phone, using the flashlight to find the switch for the overhead lights. When the lights flickered on, the room was in disarray. Furniture was overturned, books were scattered, and the Ouija board lay on the floor, the planchette still moving slightly. Karen picked up the board, her hands trembling. "We've got to get rid of this thing," she said, her voice filled with fear. Lily nodded, her face pale. "Tomorrow morning, first thing." As they tried to clean up the mess, the weight of their mistake settled heavily on them. Karen couldn't shake the feeling that they'd crossed a line that night, a line that couldn't be uncrossed. And as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the whispers from the living room seemed to follow her, a haunting reminder of the spirit they'd unwittingly set free. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in Karen's home grew increasingly oppressive. It started with small things, lights flickering, doors creaking open on their own, and cold drafts that seemed to come from nowhere. Karen tried to brush it off as her imagination, but the unease gnawed at her. One evening, while she was reading in the living room, a framed photo of her family fell from the mantel and shattered on the floor. Startled, Karen picked it up and noticed that the glass was cracked in a way that seemed to spell out the letters M and A. She shivered, recalling the name spelled out on the Ouija board. Malachi. Unable to ignore the growing sense of dread, Karen decided to seek help. She visited Dr. Raines, a local demonologist known for her expertise in the occult. His office, filled with ancient books and strange artifacts, had an air of both mystery and authority. "Right, tell me everything," Dr. Raines said, his eyes serious and focused. Karen recounted the events of the night she and Lily used the Ouija board, describing the messages, the sudden cold, and the unsettling phenomena that followed. Dr. Raines listened intently, nodding. "This is more than a simple haunting. The board you described is an artifact of significant power, especially given its macabre construction. The spirit you contacted, Malachi, was likely a sorcerer in life, and his malevolence has only grown in death." "What can I do?" Karen asked, desperation creeping into her voice. "Well, the spirit seeks freedom," Dr. Raines explained, "and it appears willing to use you as a conduit. We need to perform a binding ritual to contain it. But be warned, this will be dangerous." That night, Karen returned home with a list of items needed for the ritual. Candles, salt, protective sigils, and a vial of holy water. She called Lily, who reluctantly agreed to help. As they prepared for the ritual, the paranormal activity escalated. Objects flew off shelves, eerie whispers filled the air, and shadows seemed to move on their own. The tension was palpable, and both women were on edge. "We need to hurry," Karen said, lighting the candles and placing them in a circle around the Ouija board. They then sat on the floor, salt forming a protective barrier around them. Dr. Raines had instructed them on the steps of the ritual, emphasizing the importance of focus and intent. Karen began to chant the incantation Dr. Raines had provided. The air grew colder, and the candles flickered violently. The room seemed to vibrate with a dark energy. Lily's eyes darted around, wide with fear. "Stay focused," Karen urged, though she herself was also trembling. The planchette on the Ouija board began to move on its own, spelling out frantic messages. RELEASEME The board seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a palpable malevolence emanating from it. Suddenly, the room plunged into darkness as the candles were snuffed out by an unseen force. The only light came from the faint glow of the planchette, which now hovered above the board, spinning wildly. Karen's voice wavered, but she continued the incantation, her words growing stronger with each syllable. The air around them crackled with energy, and a low, guttural growl echoed from the room. A shadowy figure began to form above the Ouija board, its eyes glowing with an unearthly light. Malachi's spirit had manifested, and it was furious. The temperature dropped to an unbearable cold, their breath visible in the icy air. "Karen, I'm scared," Lily whispered, clutching Karen's arm. "Keep going," Karen insisted, her voice resolute. "We're almost there." The spirit lunged at them, its form shifting and writhing. Karen threw the holy water at it, and the entity recoiled with a hiss, smoke rising where the water had made contact. But it wasn't enough to dispel it. Desperate, Karen picked up the Ouija board and held it aloft. "By the power of this board, I command you, Malachi, to be bound." The board vibrated violently, and a blinding light erupted from it. Malachi's spirit screamed, a sound that reverberated through their very bones. The light grew brighter, enveloping the spirit and pulling it back into the board. And the room fell silent. The oppressive cold lifted, replaced by a heavy stillness. Karen and Lily sat in the aftermath, breathing heavily, their hands still shaking. "Did it work?" Lily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Karen looked at the Ouija board, now inert and lifeless. "I think so," she said, but a part of her still felt the lingering presence of Malachi, a dark shadow that had imprinted itself on her very soul. They cleaned up the ritual remnants and secured the Ouija board in a locked chest, determined to keep it sealed away. But the events of that night had left a mark on both women, a sense of foreboding that refused to fade. Karen knew they'd only just begun to understand the true depth of the darkness that they'd unleashed, and the thought haunted her as she lay in bed that night, the whispers of Malachi still echoing in her mind. The following days brought a fragile sense of normalcy to Karen's life, but the tension lingered like a shadow. The Ouija board remained locked in the chest, and Karen made sure to avoid any further interaction with it. And yet the haunting continued in subtler, more insidious ways. Karen's dreams were plagued by visions of Malachi, his dark form always looming at the edge of her consciousness. One evening, Karen came home to find her apartment in disarray. Drawers were pulled out, their contents strewn across the floor. Her cat, Midnight, was hiding under the couch, hissing and terrified, and the sight sent a chill down her spine. "Lily?" Karen called, hoping her friend had stopped by, though she knew it was unlikely. She cautiously stepped further into the apartment, her heart pounding. She found her bedroom door slightly ajar, and as she pushed it open, she saw it. The chest that had held the Ouija board was wide open, its contents empty. No, Karen whispered, a wave of dread washing over her. "This can't be happening." In the center of her bed lay the Ouija board, the planchette placed neatly on top. It was as if Malachi was mocking her, taunting her for thinking she could contain him. Panic gripped her, and she immediately called Dr. Raines. "I told you to keep it secure," Dr. Raines said, his voice a mix of frustration and concern. "This is bad, Karen. Very bad." "I did. I locked it away," Karen argued, but her voice was tinged with desperation. "What do I do now?" "Come to my office. Bring the board," Dr. Raines instructed. "We need to take more drastic measures." Karen carefully wrapped the Ouija board in a cloth and placed it in a sturdy box, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling that it was pulsing with a dark energy. She drove to Dr. Raines' office, her mind racing with fear and anxiety. Raines met her at the door, his expression grave. He led her to a back room filled with arcane symbols and protective charms. I will perform a more powerful binding ritual here. But you must understand, Karen. The spirit of Malachi is cunning and strong. This will be dangerous. Karen nodded, her resolve hardening. I'll do whatever it takes. God, I can't live like this anymore. They began the preparations, setting up a circle of protective runes and lighting candles infused with sacred herbs. Dr. Rains handed Carol a small vial of her own blood, which he collected from a previous visit. But this is your blood. It's a part of the ritual, he explained. Malachi seeks freedom through blood, but will use yours to bind him instead. Karen shivered at the thought, but understood the necessity. They placed the Ouija board in the center of the circle and began the incantation. The air grew thick with tension, and the room seemed to darken despite the candlelight. As they chanted, the planchette started to move, spelling out frantic messages. HELPMEKILLTHEM. Malachi's spirit grew more aggressive, the room vibrating with his fury. A cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing several of the candles. The shadows on the walls seemed to come to life, twisting and writhing. Karen could feel Malachi's presence, his rage palpable. Stay strong, Karen, Dr. Rains shouted over the howling wind. We're almost there. Karen poured the vial of her blood onto the Ouija board, the liquid seeping into the bone-white surface. The board seemed to absorb it, glowing with an eerie red light. Malachi's form began to manifest, a shadowy figure with glowing eyes, hovering above the board. I command you, Malachi, by the power of this blood and these sacred rites, to be bound forever, Dr. Rains intoned, his voice echoing with authority. Malachi screamed, a sound that resonated deep within Karen's soul. The figure writhed and contorted, fighting against the binding spell. The glow intensified, and Karen felt a searing pain in her chest as if a part of her was being ripped away. With a final, agonizing shriek, Malachi's form was pulled back into the Ouija board. The red glow faded, and the room fell silent. The oppressive cold lifted, replaced by an almost eerie calm. Karen collapsed to the floor, exhausted and trembling. Dr. Rains quickly secured the Ouija board in a lead-lined box, inscribing it with protective runes. It's done, he said, helping Karen to her feet. Malachi is bound, but you must remain vigilant. His influence won't disappear overnight. Karen nodded, her body aching and her spirit weary. She knew this was only a temporary respite, but for now she could breathe a little easier. As she left Dr. Rains' office, the weight of her ordeal pressed heavily on her, a constant reminder of the darkness she'd encountered and the lingering presence of Malachi, still lurking in the shadows of her mind. Part 2. Weeks passed, and while the intense paranormal activity had subsided, Karen couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Her dreams remained haunted by Malachi, and strange occurrences continued to plague her daily life. Objects would occasionally move on their own, and she often awoke to find cryptic messages scrawled in condensation on her bathroom mirror. Free me. Let me out. One night Karen was jolted awake by a loud crash. She sat up in bed, her heart racing, and listened intently. The noise had come from the living room. She grabbed her phone and crept down the hallway, the dim light casting eerie shadows across the walls. As she approached the living room, she saw the lead-lined box containing the Ouija board lying open on the floor. The protective runes had been scratched off, and the board was missing. Panic surged through her. No, she whispered, dread tightening her chest. She heard a low, guttural growl from behind her. Whirling around, she came face to face with Malachi's spirit, now more tangible and terrifying than ever. His eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and his form flickered in and out of visibility, like a dark shadow fighting to solidify. "Foolish girl," Malachi hissed, his voice echoing unnaturally. "You thought you could bind me. You're but a pawn in my game." Karen stumbled backward, her mind racing. "What do you want from me?" "Your blood," Malachi snarled. "Your soul. Release me and I may spare you." Karen's survival instinct kicked in. She ran to the kitchen, grabbing a sharp knife for protection, though she knew it would do little against a spirit. Malachi followed, his form gliding through the air effortlessly. She reached for her phone, dialing Dr. Raines with trembling fingers. The call went to voicemail. "Dr. Raines, it's Karen. Malachi is loose. The board, Her message was cut off as the phone was yanked from her hand by an unseen force and smashed against the wall. Malachi advanced, his presence overwhelming. Karen's thoughts flashed to the vial of her blood they'd used in the previous ritual. She needed to find a way to use it again, to turn his power against him. In a desperate move, Karen bolted to her study, where she kept her research on the occult and the notes from Dr. Raines. Malachi's form was growing more distinct, his anger palpable. "You cannot escape me," he roared, the walls vibrating with his rage. Karen rifled through her desk, finding the vial of her blood and the protective charms she'd stashed away. Her hands shook as she drew a protective circle on the floor with salt and placed the charms around it. She stepped inside, clutching the vial tightly. Malachi appeared at the doorway, his form solidifying more. "This will not save you," he sneered. Karen took a deep breath, holding the vial up. "By my blood, I bind you, Malachi. By my will, I command you to be sealed once more." Malachi lunged at her, but the protective circle flared to life, a barrier that halted his advance. He howled in fury, the sound almost deafening. Karen began to chant the binding spell, her voice growing stronger with each word. The room shook violently as Malachi thrashed against the barrier, his form flickering. The energy around them crackled, and the air grew cold. Karen's focus sharpened, her fear giving way to determination. "By the power of my blood, by the strength of my spirit, I command you, Malachi, to be bound." She poured the vial of blood onto the floor within the circle, the liquid glowing with a supernatural light. The glow intensified, enveloping Malachi's form. He screamed, a sound of pure agony, as the light pulled him toward the center of the circle. "No," Malachi bellowed, his form being torn apart by the force of the spell. "You cannot do this." Karen continued the chant, her voice unwavering. The glow grew bindingly bright, and with a final ear-splitting scream, Malachi was sucked back into the Ouija board, which appeared in the center of the circle, now cracked and smoking. The room fell silent, the oppressive energy lifting. Karen collapsed to the floor, exhausted but victorious. She stared at the damaged Ouija board, her breathing ragged. It was over, for now. As she lay on the floor trying to catch her breath, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Dr. Raines. "On my way. Stay strong." Karen managed a weak smile. She'd faced Malachi and survived. But she knew deep down that this battle had left scars, and the shadows of the past would always linger, a reminder of the darkness she'd encountered. The days following the climactic encounter with Malachi were a whirlwind of recovery and reflection for Karen. Dr. Raines arrived shortly after her ordeal, finding her exhausted but resolute. He inspected the cracked Ouija board with a mixture of relief and concern. "Oh, you did well, Karen," Dr. Rains said, his voice gentle but serious. "But this board is still dangerous. We need to destroy it completely." Karen nodded, her eyes lingering on the fractured board. "How do we do that?" "Oh, there's a ritual to neutralize its power and render it harmless," Dr. Rains explained. "We must act quickly before any residual energy can escape." They gathered the necessary items: purified water, a ceremonial dagger, and a sacred fire pit located at the edge of town, where many ancient rituals had been performed for centuries. Karen felt a strange sense of déjà vu as they prepared for the final step in containing Malachi's malevolent spirit. The night was dark and clear as they arrived at the fire pit, a circle of stone surrounding a deep, charred basin. The air was crisp, and the sounds of the forest around them seemed to hold their breath, as if nature itself was aware of the importance of this moment. Dr. Rains set the Ouija board in the center of the pit and began chanting in an ancient language. Karen watched as he drew symbols in the air with a ceremonial dagger, the blade glinting in the firelight. She poured the purified water over the board, the liquid sizzling as it made contact with the bone-like surface. "The sacred flames will cleanse the board," Dr. Rains said, lighting a bundle of herbs and tossing it into the pit. The flames roared to life, casting an eerie glow over the clearing. Karen stepped back, her heart pounding. As the flames consumed the board, she felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. The fire crackled and popped, the symbols on the board glowing briefly before disintegrating into ash. "By these flames, we purify this vessel," Dr. Rains intoned. "By our will, we banish the darkness within." The fire blazed higher, and a sudden gust of wind swirled around them. Karen could almost hear Malachi's anguished scream carried on the wind, a final desperate cry as his essence was eradicated. The flames gradually died down, leaving nothing but a pile of smouldering ashes. "It's done," Dr. Rains said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Malachi is gone for good." Karen let out a shaky breath, feeling the tension drain from her body. "Oh, thank you, Dr. Rains. I don't think I could have done this without you." He smiled kindly. "You show great courage, Karen. Many would have faltered, but you faced the darkness head-on." As they made their way back to the car, Karen felt lighter than she had in weeks. The oppressive weight of Malachi's presence was gone, replaced by a sense of calm and clarity. She knew she still had a long road to recovery, but the worst was behind her. Over the next few weeks, Karen worked to rebuild her life. She cleaned and reorganized her apartment, reclaiming her space from the remnants of the haunting. She also took up meditation and began seeing a therapist to help process the trauma she'd endured. Lily visited often, offering support and companionship. The bond between them had grown stronger through their shared ordeal. One evening, they sat on Karen's balcony, sipping tea and watching the sunset. "I'm proud of you, Karen," Lily said, breaking the comfortable silence. "You faced something terrifying and came out stronger." Karen smiled, feeling a warmth in her heart. "I couldn't have done it without you, Lily. You were there for me when I needed you the most." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, Karen felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. She knew there'd be still challenges ahead, but she was no longer afraid. The darkness had been vanquished, and she was ready to embrace the light. One day Karen received a package from Dr. Rains. Inside was a small, intricately carved box with a note. "For your protection. Should you ever need assistance again, you know where to find me." Karen opened the box to find a collection of protective charms and a book on advanced demonology. She smiled, feeling a sense of closure. She placed the box on her shelf, a reminder of the strength she'd discovered from within herself. As she stood in her living room, looking around at the life she'd reclaimed, Karen knew she was not alone. She had her friends, her newfound knowledge, and the confidence that she could face whatever came her way. And with that, she turned the page on this dark chapter of her life, ready to move on with courage and hope. Months had passed since Karen had faced Malachi and emerged victorious. Life had returned to a semblance of normalcy, and she was beginning to believe that the nightmare was truly behind her. She'd resumed her daily routines, found comfort in the support of her friends, and even started dating again. One evening, after a pleasant dinner date, Karen returned home to find a small package on her doorstep. It was wrapped in plain brown paper, with no return address. Puzzled, she carried it inside and placed it on the kitchen table. She carefully unwrapped the package, revealing an old, leather-bound book. There was a note tucked inside the cover. "Thought this might interest you. A friend." Curiosity piqued, Karen flipped through the book. It was filled with ancient rituals and spells written in a language she didn't recognize. As she examined it, a particular page caught her eye. It depicted a binding ritual strikingly similar to the one she'd performed with Dr. Rains, but with one significant difference: a final step that had been omitted from their ritual. Her heart began to race as she read the translation at the bottom of the page. To fully seal the malevolent spirit, the vessel must be destroyed at the place of origin. A sinking feeling settled in her stomach. Could it be possible that their ritual had been incomplete? She grabbed her phone and called Dr. Rains, her voice urgent. "Dr. Rains, I found something. A book that suggests we missed a crucial step in binding Malachi." There was a long pause before Dr. Rains responded, his voice grave. "Karen, where did you get this book?" "It was left on my doorstep," she replied, her mind racing. "There's no return address, just a note saying it was from a friend." Dr. Rains sighed. "I need to see this book. Come to my office immediately." Karen quickly gathered the book and drove to Dr. Rains's office. He examined it with a furrowed brow, nodding slowly as he read the passage. "Well, it seems our initial ritual was indeed incomplete," he said finally. "The true binding must be completed at the site where the board was first created." "Where's that?" Karen asked, dread gnawing at her. Dr. Rains hesitated before replying. "The board was crafted in an old, abandoned church on the outskirts of town. Oh, it's a place of dark history where many such artifacts were created." Determined to put an end to Malachi's influence once and for all, Karen and Dr. Rains prepared for the final ritual. They gathered the necessary items, including the protective charms from the package and the remnants of the Ouija board, now carefully collected from the fire pit. As they drove to the abandoned church, the sky grew darker, the air thick with an ominous energy. The church stood like a sentinel of forgotten horrors, its dilapidated structure casting eerie shadows in the moonlight. Inside, the air was stale and cold. Broken pews and shattered stained glass windows littered the floor. At the altar, they set up the ritual circle, placing the Ouija board fragments in the center. Dr. Rains began the chant, the ancient words echoing through the empty hall. Karen joined in, her voice strong and determined. As they chanted, the air grew colder and the shadows around them seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Suddenly a fierce wind whipped through the church, extinguishing their candles. In the darkness, Karen felt a familiar, chilling presence. Malachi's spirit manifested, more furious and powerful than before. "You think you can defeat me?" Malachi roared, his form towering above them. "You are nothing but pawns in a game you cannot comprehend." Karen's resolve hardened. She held up the protective charms, their faint glow cutting through the darkness. "We will finish this, Malachi. Your reign of terror ends tonight." Dr. Rains continued the chant, his voice unwavering. The charms in Karen's hands began to pulse with energy, their light growing brighter. Malachi screamed, a sound of pure rage and agony, as the light enveloped him. The ground beneath them shook violently, and the fragments of the Ouija board glowed with an intense heat. The church seemed to come alive with a dark energy, the walls vibrating with Malachi's fury. By the power of this sacred place, by the light of our will, we command you, Malachi, to be bound forever, Karen shouted, pouring every ounce of her strength into the words. A blinding flash of light erupted from the circle, and Malachi's form was sucked into the board fragments. The ground shook one last time before falling silent. The oppressive cold lifted, replaced by an eerie calm. "It's done," Dr. Rain said, his voice filled with relief. As they gathered the remnants of their ritual, Karen noticed something odd. One of the protective charms had a small inscription on it that she hadn't seen before. She held it up to the light, her eyes widening as she read the words, "Property of Malachi." The blood ran cold. She looked at Dr. Rains, who was staring at the charm with a mixture of horror and realization. "Karen," he said slowly, "we've been tricked. This charm was his all along." Before they could react, the ground beneath them split open and a dark, malevolent energy surged forth. Malachi's laughter echoed from the church as his spirit, now freed and more powerful than ever, rose from the depths. "You cannot bind me," Malachi sneered, his form solidifying. "You've only made me stronger." Karen and Dr. Rains backed away, their hearts pounding with fear. The final twist of Malachi's game had been revealed, and they were trapped in the very place where his power was strongest. As the darkness closed in, Karen realized the true extent of Malachi's cunning. The battle was far from over, and the real fight for her soul was just beginning. The Silent Watchers by Darius McCorkindale. Greg's alarm clock buzzed at precisely 7 a.m., a monotonous hum that marked the beginning of another uneventful day in the suburbs. He groaned, stretched, and reluctantly swung his legs out of bed, his feet sinking into the plush carpet of his bedroom. After a quick shower and a cup of coffee, Greg made his way to the front window, as was his morning routine. Well, the view was the same as always, a picturesque scene of well-manicured lawns, wide picket fences, and neatly trimmed hedges. The neighborhood of Maplewood had always been a beacon of suburban tranquility, where the most exciting event was the annual 4th of July barbecue. It was a place where everyone knew each other's names, and nothing out of the ordinary ever happened. But today was different. As Greg sipped his coffee, he noticed a group of 7 or 8 people standing outside his neighbor Serge's house. The sight was unusual enough to catch his attention. Like statues, their faces blank and expressionless. Greg frowned, trying to recall if Serge had mentioned expecting visitors. Well, curiosity got the better of him, and Greg grabbed his phone and dialed Serge's number. It rang several times before Serge answered, his voice groggy and confused. "Hello?" "Hey, Serge, it's Greg. You know there's a group of people outside your house?" "What? No, I didn't notice. What do they want?" "Well, I'm not sure. They're just standing there. It's kind of creepy." Serge sighed. "All right, I'll go check it out. Hey, thanks for letting me know." "Hey, I told you those conspiracy theories would get you in trouble one day, Serge." Serge let out a soft chuckle. "Like I always told you, Greg, it's not a conspiracy if it's true." "Well, looks like they're drinking too much of the local water, eh?" Greg hung up and continued to watch from his window as Serge emerged from his house, dressed in a bathrobe, and approached the group. He called out to them, waving his arms to get their attention, but there was no response. After a few moments, Serge turned back toward his house, scratching his head in bewilderment. Greg shrugged and decided it was probably some weird prank or a case of mistaken identity. He went about his morning routine, making breakfast and preparing for work. But as he moved through his house, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in his stomach. Half an hour later, Greg returned to the front window to check on the situation. His breath caught in his throat. The group had moved. Now they were standing in front of his house, and Serge was among them, his face just as expressionless as the others. They stood in a perfectly straight line, staring directly at Greg's window. A chill ran down Greg's spine. He felt a sudden, inexplicable dread. The people didn't move or speak. They simply watched him with vacant eyes. It was as if they were waiting for something, or someone, and Greg had the sinking feeling that it had everything to do with him. Greg's heart pounded as he stared at the silent, expressionless group outside his window. The unease that had been simmering in his gut now churned violently. He set his coffee mug down with a trembling hand, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "Serge," Greg called out, opening his front door just a crack. "Hey, Serge, what's going on?" No response. The group didn't even blink. They stood like statues, their empty gazes fixed on him. Greg's mind raced. What could cause such bizarre behavior? Well, he knew he had to do something. He couldn't just stand there and let this eerie spectacle continue. He pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed Serge again. The call went straight to voicemail. Frowning, Greg tried a few more neighbors, but no one picked up. It was as if he was the only person left in the neighborhood who wasn't part of this unsettling tableau. With mounting dread, Greg decided to call the police. His fingers fumbled over the keypad as he dialed 911. The operator's calm, professional voice was a small comfort. 911, what's your emergency? This is Greg Parrow from Maplewood. There's a group of people standing outside my house, including my neighbor, Serge. Well, they're not moving or responding, just staring. It's really weird and creepy. The operator paused before responding. Are they threatening you in any way, sir? No, they're just standing there. But something's really wrong. They look vacant, like they're in some kind of trance. All right, sir. I'll dispatch an officer to your location. Please stay inside your house and do not approach the individuals. Greg hung up and took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He backed away from the door, his eyes never leaving the group outside. He could feel their gaze boring into him, even through the walls of his house. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Greg paced the living room, glancing at the clock every few seconds. The silence outside was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. His mind raced with possibilities, each one more disturbing than the last. Finally, he heard the distant wail of sirens. Relief washed over him as a police car pulled up to the curb. Two officers stepped out, cautiously approaching the group. Greg watched through a gap in the curtains, his heart still pounding in his chest. The officers tried to engage the group, speaking in calm, authoritative tones. When that elicited no response, one of the officers gently shook Serge's shoulder. Well, the moment he made contact, Serge's head snapped around to face the officer, his eyes wide and unseeing. The other members of the group followed suit, their heads turning in perfect unison. The officers exchanged uneasy glances. One of them spoke into his radio, calling for backup. Greg's stomach churned with fear. Whatever was happening to these people, it was beyond the scope of a routine police call. Just then, Serge's voice, cold and mechanical, broke the silence. "We are here for Greg Parrow." The officers looked stunned. One of them turned towards Greg's house, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. Greg stepped back from the window, his mind reeling. What did they want from him? Before he could process what was happening, the group outside began to move in perfect synchronization, stepping closer to his house. The police officers shouted commands, but the group ignored them, their focus steady. Panic surged through Greg as he realized the severity of his situation. He raced to the back of the house, his mind screaming at him to find a way out. had no idea what these people wanted or why they were fixated on him, but he knew one thing for certain. He had to escape, and fast. Greg's mind raced as he bolted the back door and ran to the garage, hoping to find some means of escape or protection. The garage was cluttered with boxes, gardening tools, and his old mountain bike. He grabbed a crowbar, feeling a semblance of security with the cold metal in his hand. Outside, he heard the police officers shouting, their voices growing more urgent. Greg peeked through the small garage window and saw the group advancing on the house, the officers trying to form a barrier between them and the door. But the watchers moved with a single-minded purpose, their eyes never leaving the front of the house. Greg's phone buzzed. He snatched it from his pocket and saw a new message from an unknown number. They are under control. Do not trust anyone. Get out now. And his blood ran cold. He had no time to ponder the cryptic warning. He slipped out the back door, staying low, and sprinted through the narrow alley behind his house. He needed answers, and the only place he could think to find them was in Serge's house. He remembered the strange documents he'd found there. Well, he hadn't meant to pry, but had chanced upon them one day. Thinking back on it now, he sensed this might have something to do with his current predicament. As he approached Serge's back door, he saw it was ajar. The house was eerily quiet, the air heavy with an oppressive silence. Greg stepped inside, gripping the crowbar tightly, and made his way to the study, where he'd seen the documents before. Oh, the room was a mess, papers strewn everywhere. He frantically searched through them, looking for anything that could explain what was happening. His eyes fell on a folder marked Project Tranquility, Confidential. Inside were reports detailing experiments on mind control drugs, developed under the guise of a government-funded project to enhance community well-being. The drugs were designed to be dispersed through the water supply and common household items, making them virtually undetectable. Greg's stomach churned as he realized the scope of the conspiracy. His neighborhood had been a testing ground. The watchers outside weren't just random people. They were his neighbors, his friends, all unwitting victims of the experiment. And now they'd been turned into mindless drones, programmed to follow orders without question. The noise behind him made Greg whirl around, crowbar raised. It was Serge's wife, Julie. She stood in the doorway, her eyes wide with fear, but still lucid. "Oh, Greg, thank God you're here," she whispered. "We have to stop this." "Julie, what's going on? How do we fix this?" Greg asked, his voice trembling. "Serge found out about the project and he tried to warn everyone, but they got to him first," Julie explained, her voice shaking. "They used him to control the others. We need to find the central transmitter. It's broadcasting the signal that keeps them under control." "What? Where is it?" Greg demanded. "I think it's in the old water treatment plant at the edge of town. That's where they've been coordinating everything." Greg nodded, a plan forming in his mind. "We need to get there and shut it down. It's the only way to break the control." Julie agreed, and they quickly gathered supplies. Flashlights, a map, and a couple of kitchen knives. They snuck out of Serge's house and made their way through the neighborhood, avoiding the watchers who continued to stand guard outside Greg's house. As they approached the treatment plant, the air grew colder, and a sense of dread settled over them. The plant was a hulking, dilapidated building surrounded by a chain-link fence. Greg and Julie climbed the fence, cutting themselves on the rusty wire, but adrenaline pushed them forward. Inside, the plant was a labyrinth of dark corridors and strange, echoing noises. They followed the sound of a faint hum, which grew louder as they ventured deeper into the facility. Finally, they reached a large room filled with old machinery and a control panel at the far end. "There it is," Julie whispered, pointing to a transmitter unit on the wall. "That's what's controlling them." Greg approached the unit, his heart pounding. He had no idea how to disable it without causing more harm, but he knew he had to try. He started pulling wires, hoping to short-circuit the device. Suddenly, alarms blared and the hum of the machinery grew louder. "Come on, we have to hurry," Julie urged, keeping watch at the door. Greg's hands worked frantically, his mind racing. Finally, with a desperate yank, he pulled the main power cable free. The transmitter sparked and went dark. The alarm ceased and an eerie silence fell over the plant. "Did it work?" Julie asked, her voice trembling. Greg didn't have time to answer. Footsteps echoed down the corridor, getting closer. "We need to get out of here," he said, grabbing Julie's hand. They ran back through the plant, a sense of urgency driving them forward. As they emerged into the cold night air, they saw figures approaching from the shadows. The Watchers. But now something was different. Their eyes were no longer blank. They looked confused and disoriented. The control had been broken. "Greg," one of the former Watchers called out, their voice still shaky. It was Serge. Greg felt a surge of relief. "Oh, Serge, are you okay?" Serge nodded, looking around in bewilderment. "I think so. What happened?" "We'll explain everything later," Greg said, his voice filled with hope. "For now, we need to get everyone to safety and expose what's been done here." They made their way back to the neighborhood, ready to face whatever came next. For the first time, Greg felt like they had a fighting chance. As Greg and Julie led Serge and the disoriented neighbors back to the safety of Greg's house, the weight of their discovery hung heavily over them. They knew they'd taken a critical step by disabling the transmitter, but their problems were far from over. The neighborhood, once a beacon of normality, now felt like a battleground. Inside Greg's living room, the former Watchers gathered, their expressions slowly shifting from confusion to fear and anger as they began to understand the implications of what had happened to them. Greg and Julie explained the mind control experiment, showing them the documents Serge had collected. The room was filled with a mix of disbelief and outrage. "Look, we have to expose this," Serge said, his voice still shaky but determined. "People need to know what's been done to us." "But how?" Julie asked. "If we just go to the police, they'll dismiss us. Or worse, they might be in on it." Greg paced the room, deep in thought. "We need some solid evidence and a way to get it out to the public quickly. The documents we have are a start, but we need more. Something irrefutable." As they debated their next steps, Greg's phone buzzed again. It was another message from the unknown number. "They know. Reinforcements are coming. You have 1 hour." Greg's blood ran cold. "We don't have much time. Whoever's behind this is sending more people to silence us." Panic spread through the group, but Greg raised his hands to calm them. "We need to act fast. Serge, do you know if there's any place where they might be keeping more evidence?" Serge thought for a moment. "Well, there's an old office building on the outskirts of town. It used to be a research facility. But that's where they're operating from now." "Then that's where we have to go," Greg decided. "But we can't all go. Some of us need to stay here and secure the house. Julie, can you and a few others stay back and fortify this place? If we don't return in 2 hours, you need to go out and find help." Julie nodded. "Yeah, we'll be ready." Greg, Serge, and a few other volunteers armed themselves with what they could. Crowbars, kitchen knives, anything that might offer protection. They piled into Serge's van and headed towards the old office building, the atmosphere tense with fear and anticipation. As they approached the facility, they could see it was heavily guarded. Security personnel, likely under the influence of the same mind control drug, were patrolling the perimeter. Greg and the others parked a distance away and formulated a plan. "We'll split into 2 groups," Greg said. "One will create a diversion while the other sneaks in and gathers evidence. Greg, Serge, and one other neighbor, Joanne, volunteered for the infiltration team, while the rest prepared to distract the guards. The diversion team set off fireworks and started small fires on the opposite side of the building, drawing the guards away from their posts. With the path temporarily clear, Greg and his team slipped into the building through a back entrance. The interior was a maze of corridors and offices, filled with high-tech equipment and stacks of documents. They moved quickly, gathering as much evidence as they could find. Files, computer hard drives, anything that might prove the existence of Project Tranquility. In the central office, Greg found a locker drawer labeled Project Logs. He pried it open with his crowbar and pulled out a thick file. As he skimmed through the pages, his eyes widened. Detailed logs of experiments, names of the affected individuals, and correspondence with higher-ups in the government. This was exactly what they needed. "Right, let's get out of here," Serge urged, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "We've got enough." As they turned to leave, alarms blared throughout the building. The guards were returning, alerted by the diversion. Greg's heart pounded as they raced back through the labyrinthine corridors, clutching their precious evidence. They burst out of the back entrance and sprinted towards the van, dodging the searchlights and the shouts of the guards. As they neared the vehicle, a guard lunged at Serge, tackling him to the ground. Greg swung the crowbar, knocking the guard out, and pulled Serge to his feet. They piled into the van and sped away, the facility shrinking in the rearview mirror. Greg clutched the file to his chest, knowing they had what they needed to expose the conspiracy. But as they drove back to the neighborhood, headlights appeared in the distance, growing closer. "No, they're coming after us," Joanne said, her voice trembling. Greg's mind raced. He had to get the evidence to safety, but how? He pulled out his phone and handed it to Serge, who called Julie. "Julie, we have what we need, but they're right behind us. We're leading them away from the neighborhood. Be ready to move the others if we don't make it back." Julie's voice was firm. "Got it. Be careful, Serge." He handed the phone back to Greg, who hung up and looked at Serge and Joanne. "Hey, we have to split up. Serge, take the evidence and go to the local news station. They need to see this. Joanne and I will lead them away." Serge hesitated, but nodded. They pulled over briefly, handing the files and hard drives to Serge. "Hey, good luck," Greg said, gripping Serge's shoulder. Serge took off into the night, while Greg and Joanne continued driving, the headlights of their pursuers getting closer. The chase was on, and Greg knew they were running out of time. Part 2. Greg's knuckles turned white as he gripped the steering wheel, the van hurtling down the dark, deserted road. Joanne kept glancing nervously over her shoulder at the headlights growing larger in the rearview mirror. The black SUVs chasing them were relentless, their engines roaring with a menacing intensity. "We need to lose them," Joanne said, her voice tight with fear. "I know," Greg replied, his mind racing. The road ahead split into a T-junction, and without hesitation, Greg swerved sharply to the left, tires screeching as the van struggled to maintain traction on the gravel. The SUVs followed, the gap between them closing. Greg spotted an old, overgrown logging road up ahead. "All right, hold on," he shouted as he veered off the main road, the van jolting violently as it plunged into the dense forest. Branches scraped against the sides of the van, and the headlights flickered as they bounced over the rough terrain. The logging road twisted and turned, a labyrinth of narrow paths and hidden obstacles. Greg maneuvered the van with skill, but the SUVs were built for off-road pursuits and were gaining ground. The beams of their headlights sliced through the trees, casting eerie shadows that danced in the night. "There!" Joanne pointed to a narrow trail barely visible through the underbrush. Take that path." Greg turned sharply, the van narrowly missing a large tree trunk as it barreled down the narrow trail. The SUVs hesitated, momentarily losing sight of the van. Greg and Joanne held their breath, praying the dense forest would provide enough cover to escape. For a moment it seemed like they'd succeeded. The trail opened into a small clearing, and Greg slowed the van, catching his breath. But the reprieve was short-lived. The distant sound of engines grew louder, and soon the SUVs emerged from the forest, their headlights sweeping the clearing. "We're trapped," Joanne whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Greg's mind raced. They had the evidence, but they needed to buy Serge time to reach the news station. "Well, we have to make a stand," he said, determination hardening his voice. "We can't let them get to Serge." He pulled the van to a stop and jumped out, Joanne following close behind. They took cover behind a large boulder, clutching the crowbars and kitchen knives they'd brought with them. The SUVs screeched to a halt, and men in dark suits and tactical gear poured out, their faces shadowed and menacing. "Come out with your hands up," one of the men shouted, his voice amplified by a bullhorn. "We know you have the documents. Hand them over and no one gets hurt." Greg exchanged a glance with Joanne. "Stay low and be ready to run," he whispered. The men advanced, their flashlights slicing through the darkness. Greg's heart pounded as he calculated their approach. He knew they had to create a distraction, something to give Serge enough time to get away and expose the truth. As the men drew closer, Greg grabbed a large rock and hurled it into the trees on the opposite side of the clearing. It crashed through the underbrush, and the men turned, their flashlights following the noise. Taking advantage of the distraction, Greg and Joanne darted towards another trail on the far side of the clearing. "Right, split up," Greg whispered to Joanne. "We'll have a better chance of leading them away." Joanne nodded, fear and resolve mingling in her eyes. She took off down one path while Greg sprinted down another, the sound of pursuit growing fainter as they put distance between themselves and the clearing. Greg's lungs burned as he ran, his mind focused on one goal: buying time. He could hear the shouts and footsteps behind him, but he didn't dare look back. The forest was a maze, but Greg had grown up exploring these woods and knew pretty much every twist and turn. He reached a narrow ravine and scrambled down, the loose rocks slipping under his feet. He hid behind a large boulder, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. The men's flashlights danced above the ravine, searching for any sign of movement. Greg's heart pounded in his ears as he stayed perfectly still, praying they wouldn't find him. Minutes passed, which felt like hours. Finally the men moved on, their voices fading into the distance. Greg let out a shaky breath, knowing he had to keep moving. He climbed out of the ravine and headed back towards the main road, hoping to find Joanne. As he emerged from the forest, he saw her hiding behind a cluster of trees, her eyes scanning the road. "Here, Joanne," he called softly, and she rushed over to him. "Did we lose them?" she asked, her voice trembling. For now," Greg replied. "But we need to get back to the neighborhood and make sure everyone's safe. Sarah should be at the news station by now." They made their way back through the forest, exhaustion setting in, but their determination unyielding. As they approached the neighborhood, they saw the familiar sight of their homes, a beacon of normality amidst the chaos. Julie and the others were waiting, their faces a mix of relief and worry. "Did you get the evidence?" Julie asked. "Serge has it," Greg said, a weary smile on his face. "He's on his way to the news station. It's up to him now." The group huddled together, the tension slowly easing. They'd faced a terrifying ordeal, but they'd taken a crucial step towards exposing the truth. As they looked out at the darkened streets of their neighborhoods, they knew the battle was far from over, but they were ready to face whatever came next. Greg and Joanne shared a nod of silent understanding. The evidence was out of their hands, but they'd done their part. Now they had to trust that Serge would succeed in bringing the truth to light and ending the nightmare that had consumed their lives. Greg, Joanne, Julie, and the others waited anxiously in Greg's living room, every noise outside making them jump. The adrenaline from the chase was wearing off, replaced by a heavy fatigue. Greg kept glancing at his phone, hoping for some sign that Serge had made it safely to the news station. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Greg's phone buzzed with a call. It was Serge. "Oh, Serge, did you make it?" Greg asked, his voice taut with anticipation. "Yeah, I'm here," Serge replied, his voice steady but urgent. "I've given them the documents and the hard drives. Oh, the news director is shocked. They're going to go live with the story tonight." A collective sigh of relief swept through the room. Well, they'd done it. They'd exposed the conspiracy. "That's great news, Serge," Greg said, a smile breaking through his exhaustion. "Now stay safe. They'll be looking for you." "You too, Greg," Serge replied. "I think we started a war. Be ready for the fallout." Greg hung up and turned to the group. "Well, the story's going live tonight. We did it." Cheers and hugs erupted among the neighbors. For the first time in days, there was a sense of hope. They'd struck a blow against the forces that had tried to control them. As the news broadcast time approached, they gathered around the television, the room silent with anticipation. The local news anchor appeared, his expression serious. "Well, good evening. We have breaking news on a developing story that involves a mind control experiment right here in our town. Our investigative team has uncovered shocking documents detailing a project known as Project Tranquility, which was allegedly funded and conducted by a government agency. The project involved dispersing mind control drugs through the local water supply and other means, affecting many residents of our community. We have obtained exclusive evidence and interviews with those affected." Footage of Serge handing over the documents played on the screen, followed by interviews with several of their neighbors, detailing their experiences and the mind control that they'd been subjected to. The broadcast was powerful and damning, laying bare the sinister experiment that had turned their lives upside down. The phone lines at the station lit up with calls from concerned citizens and reporters from national networks. The story was going viral, spreading like wildfire. Greg and the others watched, a mix of relief and vindication washing over them. They'd succeeded in getting the truth out. But their relief was short-lived. As the broadcast continued, there was a loud crash outside. Greg rushed to the window and saw several black SUVs pulling up, armed men spilling out and surrounding the house. Well, the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The people behind Project Tranquility weren't going to go down without a fight. "They're here," Greg shouted, adrenaline surging back through his veins. "Well, we need to defend the house." Julie and the others sprang into action, barricading doors and windows with furniture and anything they could find. Greg grabbed the crowbar again, ready to defend his home and the people inside. The armed men began pounding on the door, shouting commands for them to surrender. Greg stood firm, his heart pounding. "We won't let them take us," he said, stilling himself for the confrontation. Suddenly a loudspeaker crackled to life outside. "This is the FBI. Stand down and put your weapons on the ground." Greg's heart skipped a beat. He exchanged a bewildered glance with Joanne. Had their story reached the right people in time? Through the window, Greg saw men in tactical gear, emblazoned with the FBI logo, moving in and disarming the armed men from the SUVs. The scene was chaotic, but it was clear that the tide had turned in their favor. A few moments later, an FBI agent knocked on the door. "We're here to help," he called out. "It's safe now." Greg and the others cautiously opened the door, relief flooding through them as the agents entered. "We've been tracking this operation for a while," the agent explained. Your broadcast gave us the evidence we needed to act. Tears of relief and exhaustion streamed down Julie's face. Thank you, she said, her voice breaking. We didn't know how much longer we could hold out. The FBI agents secured the house and escorted the residents to safety, providing medical attention and taking statements. Greg felt the tension draining from his body, replaced by a profound sense of gratitude and disbelief. They'd survived, and the truth was out. In the following days, the news of Project Tranquility spread nationwide. Investigations were launched, and those responsible were arrested. The neighborhood began the slow process of healing, the shared trauma forging a stronger bond among the residents. Greg and Joanne stood on Greg's porch, looking out at the quiet, sunlit street. The nightmare was over, but the scars remained. We did it, Joanne said softly, her eyes reflecting both relief and sorrow. Greg nodded, putting an arm around her. Yeah, we did. Now we can start to rebuild. As they watched the neighborhood slowly returning to normal, they knew that while the fight had been won, the memory of the silent watchers would stay with them forever, a stark reminder of the price of vigilance and the power of truth. The neighborhood had slowly returned to its peaceful routine, the events of Project Tranquility becoming a dark chapter that everyone was eager to close. Greg and the others had fought to expose the conspiracy and were hailed as heroes, and life seemed to be getting back to normal. The local news station continued to cover the aftermath, ensuring that the story stayed in the public eye. One sunny afternoon, Greg was sitting on his porch, enjoying a rare moment of tranquility. He sipped his coffee, watching children play in the street and neighbors chatting, revealed that the shadow of the mind control experiment had finally lifted. Just then, Greg's phone buzzed with a message. He glanced at it, expecting another news update or a message from Serge. Instead, it was a text from an unknown number. You think it's over? Greg's heart skipped a beat. He stared at the message, a cold dread creeping over him. He looked around, suddenly feeling exposed. His mind raced. Was this some kind of sick joke? Or was there something they'd missed? Before he could process the message further, Julie walked up to the porch, waving at him. Hey, Greg, how are you holding up? Greg forced a smile, slipping the phone into his pocket. I'm good, Julia. Just trying to relax. Julie sat down next to him, her expression thoughtful. It's been a wild ride, hasn't it? God, I'm glad things are finally getting back to normal. Yeah, me too, Greg replied, but his mind was still on the mysterious message. He decided not to mention it to Julie yet. No need to worry her if it turned out to be nothing. As they chatted, Greg noticed Serge walking down the street towards them, a serious look on his face. He was carrying a small box under his arm. Greg's unease grew. Hey, what's in the box, Serge? He called out as Serge approached. Serge climbed the porch steps, his expression grim. Hey, we need to talk, he said, setting the box down on the table between them. He opened it, revealing a series of documents and a small device that looked like a scanner. What's this? Julie asked, leaning in to examine the contents. Serge took a deep breath. After everything that happened, I couldn't shake the feeling that we might have missed something. So I did some digging on my own. These documents, they're from a source inside the project. They suggest that the mind control drug wasn't just in the water supply. It's also designed to be administered through electronic devices. Greg's blood ran cold. Electronic devices? You mean phones, TVs, anything connected to the internet? Serge confirmed. The drug was encoded in a way that it could be triggered remotely. We might have stopped the initial experiment, but well, the infrastructure's still there. Julie looked horrified. Are you saying they could still control us? Serge nodded. Potentially, yes. That's why I borrowed this scanner. can detect the presence of the drug in electronic devices. We need to check our phones, our computers, everything. Greg pulled out his phone, the earlier text message flashing in his mind. He handed it to Serge, who ran the scanner over it. The device beeped, a red light flashing ominously. It's in here, Serge said quietly. They've got access to all our devices. Well, panic set in among the group. Julie quickly grabbed her phone and other electronic gadgets, bringing them to Serge to be scanned. Each one beeped with the same red light, confirming their worst fears. We need to warn everyone, Greg said, his voice urgent. We need to get rid of these devices and go off the grid. Serge nodded. I'll contact the FBI and let them know what we found, but we have to act fast. If they can trigger the drug remotely, we don't know when they might do it. As they worked to gather and dismantle their electronics, the full weight of the situation settled over them. They'd won a crucial battle, but the war was far from over. The shadow of Project Tranquility still loomed, a sinister presence lurking in the very devices that they'd come to rely on. That night, as Greg lay in bed, the implications of Serge's discovery gnawed at him. The message on his phone echoed in his mind. You think it's over? He realized with a chilling certainty that the fight against those who'd sought to control them was just beginning. Those who'd created the Silent Watchers might have been exposed, but their reach was far greater than anyone had imagined. Now Greg and his friends were more determined than ever to uncover the full extent of the conspiracy and put an end to it once and for all. And so once again, we reach the end of tonight's podcast. My thanks as always to the authors of those wonderful stories, and to you for taking the time to listen. Now, I'd ask one small favor of you. Wherever you get your podcast from, please write a few nice words and leave a 5-star review, as it really helps the podcast. That's it for this week, but I'll be back again same time, same place, and I do so hope you'll join me once more. Until next time, sweet dreams and bye-bye.